Welcome to Krown Gridiron Nation, presented by PointsBet. Mike is in BMO, Gord is in Vancouver, and I am on Football Island as the clock starts on the 2-minute offense. When you get knocked down from number 1 to number 5, that makes you a little grouchy. Alabama with a 40-point blowout win over Mississippi State. John Metchie with his biggest game of the year. We'll talk with you about that in a second. 3 tackles for Calgary's Dean Leonard. 3 tackles for Guelph's Taveus Robinson as Ole Miss gets by Tennessee in front of a whole bunch of angry people at Neyland Stadium in Knoxville. Daniel Joseph with a pair of tackles as number 22 NC State easily dispenses of Boston College. All hail UConn, their first win of the year, 21-15 over Yale. Lawal Uguak with 3 tackles. Kevin Clarcius also had a big day. The misery continues in Arizona, but it's not Mo Diallo's fault. 2 tackles and a TFL for Arizona. Jared Wayne is back, being productive for Pitt. 6 catches, 94 yards, and a trip to the end zone. Pitt's at 5-1 after their win over Virginia Tech. A whole slew of Canadians putting up numbers in Clemson's 17-14 win over Syracuse. Adjo, remember him? He had a pair of catches. Alford on the other side for Syracuse, and Kenton Arku with 3 tackles for the Orange. I believe that this is something John Metchie III will be doing for a second time later this year.
Man. Oh, this dope. This is dope.
That's Brampton's Metchie getting his Cornish Trophy keeper from 2020. This week proved that he's a virtual lock to do it again, Mike.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Alabama rarely has bounce-back games as a team, and Metchie had certainly a bounce-back game as a player. 7 catches, well over 100 yards. And, you know, I'm going to keep saying this again and again and again this season. Let's not take this accomplishment for granted. Think of all of the 5-star high school recruits in the United States who want to play for Alabama as a receiver, and how many now have to wait in line because of a kid from Brampton who has gone in there and is leading, even though they lost a couple of weeks ago, you know, is still the #1 receiver in terms of catches on the #1 football factory in the United States. That's an accomplishment that we should not take for granted. John Metchie III is the Cornish winner this year unless something really strange happens, and I just don't see that happening.
I couldn't agree with you more, right? I think if Metchie got hurt, knock on wood, we hope this doesn't happen, but if Metchie gets hurt tomorrow, doesn't play another snap this season, I think he still runs away with the Cornish Trophy. And not only is it him separating himself from the pack, which he has very much been doing, especially this last week. And I should point out, just on a side note, quick shout out to our boy Marshall Ferguson, because he was absolutely right about the vengeance game from the Crimson Tide as they win by 40 this week. But the competition has not been overly strong. And let's face it, this is an offensive award, and we've thrown a few offensive names out there. Nick Mardner got off to a hot start. Now he's banged up. He's made 1 catch in his last 6 quarters. You know, Jared Wayne is coming on now, but didn't do a lot through the first half of the season. You know, Chase Brown in Big Ten play has been off more often than on, and Curtis Rourke has gotten himself benched at Ohio. So there's just not a ton of really steep competition for Metchie. He should absolutely run away with the award this year.
Let's look ahead. Who is the class that is up for a top Canadian in the NCAA in 2022 or even 23, Gord?
Well, as I alluded to before, it's an offensive award, and there is a whole bevy of intriguing young Canadian receivers out there that still have a couple years left, led by Jared Wayne, who had an excellent performance for Pitt this last weekend, getting up into the 90s in yardage, close to 100 and a touchdown. He's a guy who is making an impact for them as a sophomore. Damien Alford already catching passes at Syracuse as a redshirt freshman. Adjo is popping up on the stat sheet every now and then for a Clemson team that frankly needs to turn things over pretty quickly here, but should be in that Alabama conversation as they have been for the last decade. So there are a number of names out there, and one deep dive, if you're going to go a couple years down the road, a guy that I'm really intrigued by, and I'm curious to see how he pans out, is Tristan Michoad, who is a freshman right now at Iowa State. 6'6" he's listed at, and well over 230. This is a kid that if he's holding that kind of frame and can move to keep up with it in the Big 12 where they throw a lot, that could potentially be a name we're talking about down the road here too.
We know that Metchie will be there, but who will join him in the stateside 5? In at number 5, Calgary native and defensive lineman Justin Sambu with 5 tackles and a TFL in the Black Bears win over William and Mary. Running back Daniel Adeboboye from Bryant with 18 carries for 70 yards. That is the second week in a row he's led all rushers. It was important in a 1-point win over St. Francis. Team Canada grad Kevin Clarcius back in the 5 in UConn's first win of the year, 21-15 over Yale, 3 receptions, 21 yards, and a trip to the promised land. Jared Wayne, we missed you here. The Peterborough native, big day, 6 catches, 94 yards, and a TD in a win over Virginia Tech. And just like the team he represents, he is back with authority. John Metchie III, 7 receptions, 177 yards, and a TD in a blowout of Mississippi State. Just ahead, we'll take a trip to the Rouge Zone. Welcome back, everyone. Blowouts were back in Ontario, and furious comebacks were in the spotlight in the West in our 3-minute warning. Let's go out west as we work our way into the middle. First place battle, Bisons 2-0, Dinos 1-1. Calgary up 22 at the half. Looks familiar, right? Wrong. The Herd stampedes back with 26 unanswered points, capped by this Braden Stubbs 5-yard run, 28-20. Bisons undefeated, defending Vanier Cup champions, under 500. Hey, it was even worse for UBC at Regina, down 23-0 going into the 4th. But just like the Bisons, the Birds put up 23 in the 4th Q. Garrett Rooker hooks up with Edgerrin Williams, then runs in the 2-pointer to force OT. Both score TDs in the extra frame, but then UBC goes for 2. Trey Kellogg on the receiving end. It's a season saver for Blake Nill and the UBC Thunderbirds. Bishop's Acadia, this game some down east fun. The lead changed hands 4 times, but running back Louis-Philippe Gregoire was the difference. 16 carries, 124 yards, and 2 major scores. Acadia had a chance on the final play, but Ben George's field goal is no good. Bishops at 2-2. Acadia falls to 1-3. Mount A St. Mary's, this game was close until late in the 4th when this Terrell Connor 60-yard return on a pick 6 sealed the deal. Mounties in second behind Idle X. To Ontario, Windsor Western total domination by the Purple Ponies. A 25-point second quarter sealed the deal. Keon Edwards rushing for 171 and 2 tutties. Carnage in Kingston. We knew the Queen's D was great, but the offense finally caught up to the defense, and they did it mercilessly against Carleton. The Ravens lay an egg on the scoreboard, and the Queen's Gales remain undefeated. Guelph breaks their 2-game skid by staging the Clark Barnes Show, a reception for a TD, plus a 108-yard return. The Warriors now back into the 2-2 pack in the West. Concordia hung with Montreal, only down by 4 at the half, but then the Carbs' 2-headed monster squashed the Stingers. Running back Bertrand Boileau, 156 yards rushing, 2 TDs, and Hassan Dosso with 4 grabs for 119, plus a TD. That keeps the Blues in first. Guys, it took a while and a bye week, but 2 teams staged 23-point fourth quarter comebacks, proving again why we love the Canada West, even if you're in the center of the universe. Mike.
Hashtag no lead is safe. And with Manitoba's comeback over Calgary, I was absolutely blown away. And who at the beginning of the season had Calgary at 1-2? What I like the most about Manitoba is they didn't get away from their game plan. They kept pounding the football and pounding the football, over 230 yards on the ground. And they did it by committee as well. 3 running backs, none of whom had more than 7 carries. So I really like the way that they stuck to it and came back from a 20-2 deficit. And it overshadowed what was probably the catch of the year in U Sports. That Tyson Philpott bomb in the first half was unbelievable. And, for Manitoba, who could have really got down emotionally after that, to keep it coming back 3-0 now. They're in the driver's seat in Can West, and I don't think anybody saw 1 and 2 coming. So that was a remarkable comeback and full marks to the Bisons.
Yeah, what a game that was in Winnipeg, and if I was filling out a top 10 ballot, Manitoba would be my number 1 team in the country right now. Moving over to the rest of that conference, it's not often we talk about a game between 1 and 2 teams as a huge game, but for UBC, I mean, Jim, you and I were on the Rouge Zone on Saturday, and we were basically drafting up funeral rites for UBC's team this year because it looked like they were down and out of this one in the first half, and they've frankly been down and out and not playing well for most of the season so far. But something switched in the second half, and one of the things that triggered the turnaround was the running game led by running back Isaiah Knight, as he piled up over 140 yards on the ground for the Thunderbirds, most of which in the second half. And Garrett Rooker, the young quarterback, the Texan, who they are just blown away with what he brings at UBC, engineers a comeback triggered by a 2-point conversion in overtime. I love the call to go for 2. Trey Kellogg, their most veteran guy in the receiving corps, comes up with a key catch for them, and UBC all of a sudden has some life in a game they absolutely had to win in an environment it's not easy to win in on the road in Regina at Mosaic. So a really big victory for the UBC Thunderbirds, where their season was truly on the brink, guys.
Next up, we start our journey down the Canadian Goat Trail. Brr. If you look at the top of your CJFL standings, every conference has a clear, undefeated favorite on the road to the Canadian Bowl. And welcome back to the Great Canadian Goat Search, brought to you by PointsBet. Now, every week we will pick the greatest of all time Canadian college football players by position. When I say we, I talk about our panel of experts here on KGN, but you will get your input too. You tell us what you think on our social channels. Now, we're going to break down the talk into 3 groups. The foundation players who graduated before 1991, the next gen from post 1991 to 2005, and the QB Now group from 2006 to 2020. We will hit each position and each era through the weeks. We thought about saving this one for the end, but we wanted to come out strong, so we are hitting the quarterbacks first. Here are your foundation QBs before 1991. McMaster's Russ Jackson and Western's Frank Cosentino, both Hall of Famers. SFU's Wayne Holm, the only QB to go first in the CFL draft. Eric Guthrie, the first Canadian to win a bowl game. He did it for Boise State. Toronto's Dan Faraday and Calgary's Greg Bavra reinvented what could be done at QB. And St. Mary's Chris Flynn, the reason amateurs are inducted into the Hall of Fame. Before we go all in on Chris Flynn, gotta note this. Cosentino won the first national championship over UBC in 1959. Eric Guthrie was the first Canadian quarterback drafted into the NFL with the 49ers, and Vavra's work in Calgary changed the way offenses operated forever in Canadian college ball. Who is your guy from this group, Mike? And I think you're going down east.
Well, probably, and because you put 1990 as the cutoff, we'll go with Flynn. I also want to get a couple of other guys drafted, or at least got NFL shots. Dan Faraday from U of T was drafted by the Bengals. Jamie Bone got a look by the Dallas Cowboys. So there were some really great quarterbacks in that era. But, man, what can you say about Chris Flynn? He's the unicorn. He won the Crichton 3 times. Never won a Vanier. But, you know, as far as individual performance goes, it's very hard-pressed to find somebody who played U Sports or CIAU or CIS back in the day who, you know, really hit the heights of Chris Flynn. This is tough on one extent because you mentioned some great players. I threw in a couple of other great names. But when you look at it, it's got to be Chris Flynn from this group.
Now, the next gen group, we're going to keep this straightforward. SFU's Julio Caravetta, Bob Torrance from the U of C, Acadia grad Larry Justanis, Phil Cote from the University of Ottawa, who was one of only 3 players to win the Crichton and the Vanier MVP, and Darrell Leeson from Hudson's Bay, Saskatchewan, who threw for nearly 16,000 yards combined in his junior and college career. And throw in Tommy Dennison, the first quarterback to throw for 3,000 yards. Personally, I'm going to go for Cote, who averaged 1,800 yards passing for over 4 starting seasons, and he averaged 650 rushing yards per year. So now let's go to these panelists with obvious ties to Kingston. Gord.
I think everybody on the panel has obvious ties to Kingston, but I'll start with Tommy Dennison, who has 2 of the top 10 single game performances in CIS, CIAU, U Sports history, and a guy that I think kind of got stuck in between a couple generations. But it's important to remember that Tommy Dennison, in a low period for Canadian quarterbacks, stood as the last Canadian quarterback to be on an active roster for over a decade. And just a superlative guy that elevated a Queens program, and frankly, only running into the dynasty that was McMaster in that era was probably the only thing that prevented Dennison from collecting even more accolades and leading the Queens teams all the way to the promised land. So a guy that I think maybe gets a little bit forgotten in this generation, and a guy that is deserving of his accolades. And another guy I'd like to talk about with West Coast connections out here, who's an interesting study in this conversation, I think, is Julio Caravata, and a guy who probably has more of a pro resume on the whole than he does a college resume. And that's not to downplay what he did at Simon Fraser, but if you look at his numbers at Simon Fraser, they're good, but not exceptional. But you look at the career he carved out for himself in the pros, and he's basically a local legend here in BC, highlighted by the fact that when he was drafted by the Montreal Alouettes in their dispersal draft, he refused to go there, and they had to trade him back to BC. But Julio Caravata, another interesting guy in this conversation, as probably the guy in this generation that made the biggest pro mark.
Okay, the QB now category. All 3 of us will likely have different answers on this, guaranteed. I'll get you guys to pick your 1 and 1A, starting with Gord.
Okay, well, my 1 is Noah Picton, and I'm not going way off the board with this, but this is the guy with the all-time record in passing yardage in U Sports history, and a guy that I think for some reason is still a little bit underrated. And to be honest, I think that reason is largely because his teams weren't exceptional. You know, he didn't even win as much as the conference championship in his career. But this is a guy, a diminutive guy, that just slung the ball all over the field in a Regina offense that was built to maximize his talents, with a couple of talented receivers every year, it seemed. And he was just so much fun to watch on Regina teams that weren't necessarily great. And then my 1A is another guy that is a little bit of a homer pick for me, but a guy that I think gets overshadowed because he was part of a year that was the best quarterback year I've ever seen in the OUA, and that's Danny Brannigan. Now, Danny that year in the fall of 09 leads Queens to a national championship, and our roster was very talented, but Queens not a traditional powerhouse. Danny elevated that program, and yet he still managed to get overshadowed in that year by a couple other guys who were flirting with the all-time passing yardage record in Justin Dunk, a former contributor on this show, and of course Michael Faulds, now the head coach at Laurier. But Danny, another undersized guy, 5'11", he was listed at 6 feet, they lied, and he just was incredible. It was the calm demeanor of him mixed with being able to sling it all over the field. You know, the Argos gave him a good hard look in the pros, but that's the guy that stands out for me too.
I will cede the 2-time Cornish Award winner to Mr. Mullen coming up next, because I assume that's where he's going. I literally wrote down about 20 names on this list, and some guys that, you know, may not get their due representation down the road. Guys like Josh Sokobi and Brad Sinopoli, who a lot of people forget played quarterback. And, you know, just on and on and on. Sinagra was so good. Michael Connor and Will Finch. But because we're going with a 1A and 1B, I can't say Michael Faulds' name without saying Dan Brannigan's name. I can't say Danny Brannigan's name without saying Michael Faulds' name. So I think it's appropriate that we put them in as sort of a 1A, 1B entry. You can take whichever one you want, and I'll take whichever one is left over, because I think they were that close. Other players like Quinlan around. I mean, there's just so many guys, but I'll go with that 1A, 1B entry of Western and Queens.
I'm going to cheat. These guys are both my number 1. I'm going to go with Nathan Rourke. I'm surprised you guys didn't buy into Nathan Rourke. He's been the most impressive NCAA quarterback with a Canadian passport in history. But really my number one, and I saw him live, saw him play in front of 16,000 to open up Mosaic Stadium, and Gord stole my thunder. The number one passer all time in a single season and in a career is Noah Picton. If we could build some platform shoes for this guy that work in football, he would be on an NFL roster. His arm is that strong, his mechanics are that good, and his mind is that sharp. So step up, break our ties on Twitter at KGN on TSM. We'll be running polls all week. We'll be picking our great Canadian players each week as we move toward determining the KGN and PointsBet greatest Canadian college football teams of all time. Coming up, it's our picks of the week. NC2A pick of the week. Did we get a win out of you last week, Gord?
We did indeed. I finally broke into the win column, although I will say it's a little mitigated because I also said hit the over, and it did not hit the over. But yes, Ole Miss pulled out the triumphant 5-point victory to give me my first win of the year. And so I'm going to keep the roll going, guys. Bring out your wallets because my pick this week is Pitt -3. Our friends at PointsBet have them as a 3-point favorite against the Clemson Tigers. So I'm going a little bit bold here, but Clemson has really been struggling lately. They barely eked out a win over Syracuse last week. Their offense has been struggling to get things going. DJ Ungalele, who's supposed to be one of the top quarterbacks in the NCAA in terms of his pedigree alongside the likes of Bryce Young at Alabama, just has not been able to click so far this year. And on the Pittsburgh side, you have a guy in Kenny Pickett who is the opposite. He is in fantastic form right now. He's truly vaulted himself into the conversation as the possible QB1 in this upcoming spring's class. And with Jared Wayne, our Canadian boy, on the receiving end of a lot of those targets, I really like what I'm seeing in Pittsburgh right now. So I got the Panthers this week as home favorites -3 points.
I'm going to go way out west for this one, and since I'm standing in the Argos locker room, I thought I'd give a shout out to Sage Dockstader and New Mexico State as they go out west, way out west, out to the island to play Hawaii. And Dockstader is the guy that we're hoping is in this room in a year. We selected him 12th overall in the CFL draft, 6'7" offensive lineman. And right now New Mexico State's showing a little bit of promise and some progress on the offensive side of the football at least. They go out and play Hawaii. We've already talked about Nick Mardner as a guy that we talked about early on in the season as being a potential Cornish Trophy winner. But when you look at New Mexico State, they are scoring some more points. They may be able to keep it close. It's a 17-point spread. They may be able to cover that. I don't think there's any question Hawaii is going to win the football game. New Mexico State may be able to cover the 17.
By the way, you can catch our web extras over at footballcanada.com. And for everyone on Krown Produce Gridiron Nation, this is Jim Mullen imploring you to do this. Let's get out to the game.